Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
A couple of years ago, a legal client of mine wanted to apply for permits in Town X. Without getting too into the details, he was going to need either a rezone or variance. Some folks on the town's board probably didn't want the use as part of their overall vision, but we wanted to apply. So I wrote to the planning department asking for a pre-application meeting. 3 times. First response was that it didn't fit with zoning, and the next 2 messages went unanswered. In fact, when I resent the 3rd message, I was notified that my email was blocked, which is something you'd never expect from a municipality to have a valid request for a meeting. We applied cold, and it was denied with insufficient explanation. Before I could get an appeal going or start the variance application process, the client gave up. Figured the town was too hostile. Had to refund him unused retainer amounts, which goes against the first rule of acquisition, but was required by my retainer. Fast forward 2 years. Same guy applied for a position in my town. I'm on the board reviewing his application. He presents smoothly but glosses over a few spots on his resume that show unreliability. So I decided to toss him a few questions about how he interacts with pre-applicants. Does he meet with them, cooperate, etc.? He says the "I love meeting with property owners and will always explain rules and procedures" type of canned answer. So I press about the Zoning Board of Appeals and correspondence styles as hypotheticals. He had never met me face to face. But as the hypothetical got detailed, there was a moment when it said it. I could see the smile falter. But now, he's just lied to a board. We discussed the interview thoroughly and candidly afterwards. A more sincere applicant succeeded to the job. Edith. She was equally qualified and arguably was doing a better job on certain projects, though had less diverse experience due to not job hopping as often. A crazy little incident at the World of Walls I witnessed when visiting an aunt who lives in Texas. Pre-pandemic, this day, I went shopping with my aunt at what we shall call the store, the World of Walls. It rhymes with that, and we walked in on what could be called the most entitled, weirdest incident I have ever witnessed, with a very satisfying ending too. But I digress. On with the story. We were shopping and having a great time. Love this aunt. Talking about nothing in particular, her husband's latest project, the latest blanket she was making for her new grandbaby, etc. As we shopped, we started to hear a loud voice, and it was getting louder. Louder, rude, and very condescending in tone. It stopped briefly, then a shout, "Get out of the way!" No responding voice, so the shout came again, even louder. I said, "Get out of my way!" Being curious and a bit nosy, we went in that direction and found a woman that was every bit the description of a Karen short, bobbed hair, 2 sizes to small yoga pants shirt that looked as if she was trying to relive her youth despite being what looked like over 40 and very overripe. She was shouting at an older man who in all appearances was in no hurry and wasn't about to hurry just because she was being impatient. He turned and looked at her, not saying a word, and stared at her with hardened eyes and a no-nonsense look on his face, and turned back to what he was doing and ignored her. She turned to a nearby shopper and said loudly, "This is why I hate this state. Everyone is so rude and ignorant here." The shopper simply said, "Go back home then," and walked away. By this time, having heard her insult his home state, he turned and answered her. "This is why we hate you Californicators here, and you should make sure they know they are not welcome." What we didn't know at that time is she had been bragging loudly on how much better California was, and that Texas was full of nothing but bumpkins and rednecks. She got this shocked, "How dare you" look on her face, and actually slapped him, at which he promptly slapped her back hard enough to half spin her and nearly knock her into the closest shelves. "Shall we try that again?" he inquired mildly. "You assaulted me! I'm going to have you arrested!" she screamed at him after her brain stopped spinning in its tiny space and wound up to slap him again. He simply raised his hand, palm exposed, and looked at her. She actually did try to slap him again. This time he slapped her back hard enough she landed on her butt with a loud oof that sounded like a beached whale trying to breathe. By this time, A manager and security had gotten there in time to see her second swing at him and his reaction. To shorten what would be a long description of events with unnecessary details, they helped her up onto her feet. She immediately started with the crocodile tears and woe is me tale and told a heavily embellished version of what happened. He simply told the truth. He said, "If you doubt my word, you can always check the security cameras for what happened." In the meantime, the Karen was still crying and putting on a show and telling more and more about the incident, adding even more details that never happened, and that didn't make any sense. All the while demanding the police be called and he be arrested for assaulting her and threatening to rape her and other nonsense. We noticed in that time that no one around her believed her and some were scoffing and making disapproving sounds at her. In the end, the Karen was the one being escorted out in cuffs, and she went kicking and screaming all the way and earning herself several assault on an officer charges for kicking the officers and spitting on them in the process, and being charged with the destruction of store property. Kicked over 2 displays and destroyed a shelf as she was dragged out. The gentleman was fine and not charged with anything. Turns out he was and is an ex-Texas Ranger himself. Yes, they do still exist, but not like in the days of the Old West. There was actually a separate law enforcement agency from regular police or state trooper. So, a little backstory. I've been an electrician for almost 30 years. About 25 years or so ago, I worked at the Big Orange Apron do-it-yourself store. I liked helping people, and I have seen a lot of do-it-yourselfers make some dangerous electrical mistakes. Making electrical mistakes could cause a fire or kill someone. I like to give them advice and show them how to do it right. I would gauge people while speaking to them, and sometimes I would just say, "You are better off hiring an electrician." Sometimes they would ask me if I could do it, but I never used that as a work opportunity. Call me crazy, but I never thought it was right to try to get work that way. I didn't want people to think I was trying to get them to hire me. I would recommend local decent electricians in the area that I knew were stand-up guys and didn't push them to just one electrician. I usually didn't work in the area that I lived in. I worked there for a couple years until I just got tired and needed to spend more time with the family. So, of course, every time I would go into the store, after that other associates would direct people to me that had questions. I would always oblige. Unless the person was totally rude, I have a pure hatred for people being rude and ignorant towards others. It's like a switch flips inside of my head and my buffer goes away and no one knows, including myself, what I'll say or do. It also seems the older I get, the faster the switch gets flipped. I usually have a longer fuse when they are acting like that with me for some reason. Now, the story. I was in the Orange Apron store last Saturday. I was getting some supplies to do some electrical work at a buddy's home he had just moved into. While I was there, I noticed an older gentleman. I think he had to be at least 70. He was looking a bit confused. He was looking at breakers and panels. I stopped and asked if he needed help. He joked, asking if I could tell by the look of determination on my face. We both chuckled and proceeded to talk about his project. He was helping his son install a hot tub for his grandson's new house as a wedding gift. We got to talking and I got him on track to get everything he needed. Afterwards, we just kept talking about life in general. I love speaking to older people as they have seen more in life. As we were in deep conversation about old stores that were around years and years ago, I heard a snapping of fingers and a clearing of the throat. I turned to my right, and there she is, the wild Karen. She was in her 30s. As we look at she blurts out, "When you're done with that old guy, I need help and I've been watching you waste time with him." I kind of smile at her and turn back to the older guy. She proceeds to continuously snap her fingers and yell hello. So I turned to her and snapped my finger and returned the hello. Then we both laughed at her. Well, this enraged the Karen. She steps closer to us and starts to yell, "How dare you? You're going to lose your job today." Well, I am not one to tell someone that I am not employed here, as if you are too dense to realize I'm not wearing a bright orange apron, I am not going to waste my breath. She keeps rambling on and on loudly. I, at this point, have had enough as she has started to insult the other fella. I proceeded to snap my fingers and said in a stern voice, "Get lost." All of a sudden, the waterworks started to flow. We looked at each other and just shook our heads at the spectacle this Karen was making. All of a sudden, a guy pops up out of nowhere. She starts crying to him about how we verbally abused her. We started to laugh at her as the guy flashes a badge and proceeds to tell us that he is a local cop, a sergeant and her husband. He then says if we don't apologize, he will arrest us. Now, I'm very aware of laws and such and wasn't about to apologize. The old guy beats me to it and says, "As my friend told your wife, get lost." I looked at him and couldn't help but chuckle and have admiration for the older guy. Just as the sergeant was starting to approach us, another fella around my age came bopping around the corner. The sergeant seemed to get more arrogant as the guy got closer. The sergeant says, "Hey, Chief, could you call for a unit for these two while I cuff them?" The chief looks at him, then looks at us and says, "Dad, did you get everything for the hot tub?" Then he turns to the sergeant. And as the color drains from his face, the sergeant says, "This is your dad?" The chief says, "You're not even a detective and you figured it out." The chief then says, "I've been in the next aisle for over 10 minutes listening to you and your wife harass my dad and his friend." He then says, "I think you and your wife need to go home and I want to see you in my office at 800 tomorrow morning." It was hilarious watching the sergeant drag his wife away, telling her to shut up as she was still hurling insults. I think the sergeant finally got through to him a few aisles away as all of a sudden you hear her say, "Ong." The three of us ended chatting for about 30 minutes after that before we all went our separate ways. He then says, "I think you and your wife need to go home and I want to see you in my office at 8 a.m. tomorrow morning." It was hilarious watching the sergeant drag his wife away, telling her to shut up as she was still hurling insults. I think the sergeant finally got through to him a few aisles away as all of a sudden you hear her say, "OMG." The three of us ended chatting for about 30 minutes after that before we all went our separate ways. I was working on a project that was funded by the county. They assigned a site manager to direct and assess the job. He wasn't completely incompetent, but he was exceptionally lazy and always looking for a scapegoat. He routinely was not on site as he was supposed to be, and instead assigned a young guy as his proxy. I watched him doing side projects with county equipment and materials, but just let it go. One day, I noticed a huge error with the survey and location for the next units. This clown starts screaming at me over the phone to, "Just do it. You don't know what you're talking about." I refused, and since he wasn't there, sent everyone on the team home. The next day, he showed up late, and after getting in my face, I calmly told him I would be happy to build it on the neighbor's property if that's what he wanted. After checking the survey markings, he quietly slinked off and told his proxy we should go home until the survey crew returns. From this point forward, he had a huge issue with me, always looking for something to blame me for. It all culminated on a day we were pouring foundation walls. He checked the walls and said everything was good to go. I asked if he checked that they were plumb and got an earful about minding my business. The next morning, I walked up to a section of wall and held a level against it. It was way off. It leaned 15 inward at the top of the wall. Suddenly, he starts screaming that I had built everything wrong, calling me names, etc. I had enough and got in his face calling him a lazy, incompetent jerk. He got scared and left for the day. He eventually had this epiphany that it wasn't a big deal at all and he could easily fix it. His botched attempt failed and he spilled half a truck worth of concrete. That was the final straw for me. I told him to shut up and go away. I instructed the crew to no longer answer to him and were doing it my way. The third pour went perfectly and I took the time to measure all my work and found the error in the wall. The one thing he had been working on with his proxy, a simple support beam hadn't been attached properly and let the wall lean. After that, he was basically afraid of me and showed up maybe once a week, which I documented very thoroughly. I set a meeting with the county project manager and asked him amazing questions like, how much materials did he pay for on these side projects he was doing? Show picture of him pouring concrete. Did he inform you the one foundation wall is 15 cm off and needed to be poured 2 more? Is it normal for a site manager to work from home 75% of the time? His contract was somehow not renewed. About a year later, he walks into the office of an employment agency with a really nice resume. What he didn't know was that my wife was the manager. She had her employees set a meeting with him about a great job opportunity. I wish I had seen the look on his face when she informed him it was working for her husband. You may know him. He also worked on that county project. Screw you, dude. Used to work at a small construction company, and our old boss's nephew, who was like 48 at the time, worked with us and generally made everyone's lives miserable. He complained about everything constantly, always angry, typical short, angry little guy. Brought his wife back from the Philippines. She hated his guts, etc. The kind of guy who would pull a gun on someone getting a frisbee from his property. Was in the military and constantly talked about how cool he was. Really sad stuff, honestly. Anyway, such an entitled jerk, and he treated everyone with such disdain because his uncle owned the place. So at some point, I lose my job and I suspect it's because he's been talking badly to his uncle about me. The way they fired me was weird and sudden. This just isn't working out type of thing. So I go across the street and get a job at the competition. Better pay, better position. Like a year later, I hear he's been fired from his job by his uncle for some egregious nonsense. I think he was trying to get another coworker fired and called OSHA on them, but ended up getting the whole company in trouble and fined. So, I'm sitting at my desk one day and my boss comes to me and says, "Hey, you used to work at X, right? You remember this guy? He's applying for a job here." I take one look at the application, stare at my boss dead in the eyes and say, "If you hire this guy, it will be the worst mistake you ever made." He nods yikes. "Glad we spoke, thanks." Garbage the app. Screw Dale, you jerk.
And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching and see you next time.